In this lesson, we're going to go over the most advanced problem that we've seen so far that can possibly go wrong with your balance sheet and cash flow statement, and we'll see how you can track it down and how you can fix it even when it's not immediately obvious what's going on here. So let's just go down first and look at the absolute value of the difference here. So it looks like it's 40, 77, 105, 118, 128. So we'll keep that in mind. And what we want to do here again is whenever we have a variable difference like this, we want to look at the difference between these balance sheet items from year to year. So we'll start with cash at the top. Copy this over for these 5 columns. Then I'll do the same for long-term assets. Then I will go over to the liabilities side as well. So we have our differences in place now. So let's go in and try to match up something to this 40 that we see in year 1 right here. So looking over everything, what immediately jumps out at me is 40 right here for this other intangible assets line item. And to confirm that this one is the problem, once again, we're going to do a cumulative sum here. So we're going to start by summing from column O through column P. I'm going to anchor the O cell right here. Copy this over. So we see it matches up with our 77, 105, 118, 128 here at the bottom. So it seems likely that something is going wrong with other intangible assets or amortization of intangibles here. So to continue our detective work here, what we're going to do is just press F2 for each of these and dig in and see where exactly this formula is coming from and where the output is going to. So I'm going to press Control left bracket. So we see we're taking the old balance here. We're factoring in amortization of intangibles, and we are also factoring in the acquisition of intangibles. It looks like on the cash flow statement, the acquisition of intangibles is 0 from 2010 through 2014. So in all likelihood, that's not what the problem is here. It's probably something to do with the amortization of intangibles line item. If it were something with acquisition of intangibles, it would probably have to be a non-zero item, especially since this difference only starts happening in 2010 onward. So just pressing F2, it looks like it's exactly the same formula in each of these. So offhand, it seems like nothing here on the balance sheet itself is going wrong. So let's go down to the cash flow statement now. We want to check where this amortization of intangibles formula is coming from, because what might be happening here is that we could be double counting intangibles or double counting amortization. So I want to check and see where this is coming from. Pressing F2, and it looks like everything here is being linked to somewhere above on our statements. So it looks like for the future years, it's being linked to the income statement right here. And then for the prior years, it's being linked up to this assumptions area right here. But effectively, they're both coming from the same exact place, which is the assumptions area right here. So that's fine. And looking at the rest of the cash flow statement, it doesn't look like we're actually double counting amortization of intangibles anywhere here, unless we have something very strange going on and we're adding in something unrelated in one of these formulas. So it looks like, upon first glance, that our problem here is more subtle, because it's not something as simple as just forgetting an item or not being complete with adding or subtracting an item. One thing we could do at this point is go in and press F2 for all of these items here, but that's not really the best way or the most efficient way to solve this. What we should really do here is go back to the origin of our problem, which is the amortization of intangibles line item. You see it right here on the income statement. What I want to do here is go up to the assumptions area. Now I've been pressing Control left bracket to trace formulas back to where they're coming from, but one thing that you also have to do a lot when you're trying to balance your balance sheet or fix problems like this is to also look at inputs to formulas and see where the inputs are going to. So in this case, we know that one of the inputs here is going to the income statement. What I want to figure out though is where else this is going to. because if we can figure out where else the amortization of intangibles here is going to, then that may clue us into what we're double counting or what we're forgetting to count here. So I'm going to press Control right bracket, and we see that it just leads down to amortization of intangibles on the income statement. So it looks like the only place this is being directly linked into a formula is on the income statement. And looking at the other items here, I'm not going to go through every single one, but if you go through and press Control right bracket for each of these, you'll see that each of them is just being simply linked to the amortization of intangibles line item on the income statement. So it looks like, again, something more subtle is going on here. What we want to do now is continue to trace this and see where else this leads to, because in a lot of cases, many of these line items appear in multiple spots and are being linked to in multiple spots, which means that even if everything seems correct as it does so far, that doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, and clearly there's a problem if the balance sheet is not balanced. So I'm going to press Control right bracket right here. So we see that for one, amortization of intangibles is flowing into operating income, which is fine, that makes sense. We see it's flowing into plants, property, and equipment, and then it's also flowing into amortization of intangibles on the cash flow statement. So let's get into all three of these right now and see if there's anything strange going on. So for operating income, we are simply subtracting amortization of intangibles right here. We're not multiplying it by 2 or dividing it by 2 or anything weird like that. Similarly, on the cash flow statement, we know that we are simply linking this in directly. So there's nothing weird going on here. What we want to do now is turn our attention to plants, property, and equipment on the balance sheet. And we see here that what we're doing is we're subtracting amortization of intangibles. It's row number 50 here in each of these formulas. So I'm going to press Control left bracket to trace where this is coming from. We see we're taking the old balance, capital expenditures, depreciation, loss on PP&E, and then amortization of intangibles. And of course, that's exactly what our problem is here. The problem here is that we've already taken into account the amortization of intangibles under other intangible assets right here. So effectively, we're double counting this difference, and we're incorrectly classifying it into plants, property, and equipment on this balance sheet. Now, you could argue that in this case, this was partially our fault because we have these two separate items for depreciation and amortization of PP&E and then amortization of intangibles. But the fact is you often run into that with models, and in filings, a lot of times companies do have it broken out like that. So what we're going to do here is fix this formula. I'm going to start in 2009 because that's where our problem here begins. So I'm going to delete the last part and just copy this across with Alt-ESF. Now we're going to look, and sure enough, our balance sheet now balances. I'll just leave the differences here over on the side and leave the cumulative differences as well. So that's an example of how we track down, diagnose, and fix a more complex problem that is not immediately obvious what is going wrong. Now, in that one, I would say the key steps are first to look at what your differences in each of the balance sheet items are from year to year. And then once you have that, really what you have to do is look at the item that appears to be the culprit, check the corresponding items on the balance sheet and cash flow statement, and then if everything else seems fine there, what you have to do is go back to the origin and see where it's coming from and what it's flowing into, using the same Control right bracket key that I used in this tutorial. And it's sort of like a detective case or a crime mystery or something like that, where you have all these clues, but what you have to do is track the evidence and see what is flowing into what, trace each item precisely. With a problem like with what we saw here, you could go through and do a line-by-line audit, pressing F2 on everything and pressing Control left bracket for everything. But to be honest, you should really only be using that as a last resort because it just takes way too long. It's far more efficient to look at the differences, the numerical differences as we did here, and then only focus on tracing the items that have something to do with the difference that you're seeing. Now, if you have something more complex, even more subtle than the problem that we saw here, then it may be appropriate to start going in and doing a line-by-line audit. But if you can, it's almost always preferable to solve it and to fix your problem as we did right here, where we only focus on what seems to be contributing to our difference on our balance sheet. So hopefully now you should have a better understanding of how to track down, diagnose, and fix problems on your balance sheet and cash flow statement and how to make sure that your balance sheet balances properly. Coming up in the next video, we're going to be taking a look at some possible interview questions you may get on the topic of 3-statement models, building projections for companies, and how to properly answer those questions in the context of investment banking and private equity interviews.